Hello, I'm Chase Beaty. I'm 30-year-old. I live in Jamestown, Tennessee. My current major is interdisciplinary studies. After I graduate, I plan to either rejoin the military and continue my job in psychological operations or pursue a career in law enforcement and eventually become a detective. This brings me to my interest, which is in criminal psychology. And my research topic is going to be genetic traits, trauma, and criminal behavior, specifically violent criminal behavior, and the correlation between each of those. Which my research question is, do certain genetic traits, MA, OA-L, and trauma, increase the likelihood of violent criminal behavior? Going back to the articles I read at the beginning of the course, Cola in 2017 did an article which 18 men with violent criminal behaviors, antisocial personality disorder, and psychopathic traits, and 20 healthy men were evaluated with MRIs, psychological tests, and genetic tests to determine whether certain genetic traits influenced violent criminal behavior. The conclusion was that yes, genetic traits do have an influence on violent criminal behavior. This is important for the research of criminal psychology to take into consideration that genetic traits might increase the likelihood of criminal behavior going forward. And this is also, no independent variables were manipulated during this study and was showing the correlation between these two variables. So this would be a correlational methodology, which is in page 69 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. Article 2 is by Lewis in 2018, where they studied data from 872 twins to determine psychopathic traits, environmental effects, and criminal behavior and the correlation. This research was conducted with personality traits, surveys, and interviews. And the conclusion from this test was shown that yes, genetic traits do play a factor in criminal behavior, but environmental factors also increase the likelihood to these criminal behaviors. So this is important for criminal psychology to understand that one should not just look at genetic traits, but also look at environmental factors that can also play a part in these criminal behaviors. This goes into my preferred methodology, quantitative correlational methodology, and a 2x2 between subjects factorial design. It's factorial because we're going to have independent variables with more than one level, which can be shown on page 241 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. And it's between subjects design because these variables can't be experienced by each group since it's genetic and trauma related and their past events. The variables are going to be genetic traits and trauma, and it's a 2x2 because it's going to be 4 groups with 2 independent variables and 2 levels with those independent variables, which is going to be genetic predisposition, present or absent, and the history of trauma, high or low. This allows us to observe the effects of each of these variables and combined effects that have overall influence on the dependent variable, violent criminal behavior. This can be discussed on page 69. Again, this is a correlational methodology since none of the independent variables are going to be manipulated. Next, we're going into strengths. Since it's a between subjects design, it reduces the carryover and practice effects. This can be discussed on page 211 of Crawford's book of Introduction to Research. Also, there's going to be larger data since we have more participants in this particular research, which will have more data to pull from to either confirm or deny our conclusion of the data. Limitation is that since it's a between subject design, it requires more participants, which takes more time and resource, which this is also discussed on page 211 of the Introduction to Research. It will be challenging to determine it'll be challenging to find the correct number of participants to fit genetic traits and these trauma levels. Also, confounding variables is going to play a part in our information. Hopefully, we can reduce these understanding that maybe socioeconomic and substance abuse also might have played a fact in the influence of violent criminal behavior. Confounding variables can be discussed on page 141 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. Next, we'll be talking about inter-rater reliability because of measuring trauma can be very hard to determine, which can be hard to basically understand this information that we get from these surveys. Which leads us into reliability, which reliability is the consistency of the information that the variables are in the research, found on page 101 in Introduction to Research. Genetic tests are reliable and consistent because, your genetic makeup does not change, which allows for good test and retest reliability within the research, which is discussed on page 101 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. Also, social desirability for the reliability needs to be taken into consideration when we give our surveys out for the levels of trauma. This is when the participants answer a question a specific way because the researcher is there and they think it needs to be answered this way. This can be found on page 83 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. Going on to validity. Validity is the accuracy presented within research study to measure different variables. On page 101 of Introduction to Research. By using real-life genetic traits and criminal records to back our information, this increases the external validity within our test, which is found on page 105 in Introduction to Research, Crawford's book. The sampling of participants also need to be a perfect reflection of the population as best as possible. So the selection is going to be important in our validity whenever we are making these sampling, which can be found on 188 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. And as already discussed before, confounding variables is also a threat to this external validity. Going into data collection and analysis, we're going to use archival research to find these genetic traits for our participants and the criminal background to find the violent criminal behaviors that you can see from the past violations. Archival research can be found on page 77 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. We're going to use a stratified probability sampling to pick our participants within these subgroups to better have an equal representation of the population as we're conducting these samplings and this research. That can be found on page 166 of Introduction to Research. We're going to use surveys with closed-ended questions. This will be used to examine trauma levels and obtain an accurate numerical data for our research, which is discussed on page 79 of Crawford's Introduction to Research. When we're doing these surveys, we need to make sure construct validity does not play a part, which is in poorly worded questions that give us an inaccurate account of this numerical data. This can be found on page 105 of Introduction to Research in Crawford's book. We'll need to ensure that the study is ethical, consensual, adding respect and justice to the research of the participants. This is discussed on page 314 of Introduction to Research. Since this is a 2x2 between subjects factorial design, we're going to be using a two-way analysis of variance, ANOVA, to determine the main effects and interactions between these independent variables and influence that it has on the dependent variable. This is on page 285, Introduction to Research. This will be used to determine if the data rejects the null hypothesis or fails to reject the null hypothesis or is equal to the null hypothesis, and the level of significance between each of these independent variables and independent variable. This is on page 276 of Introduction to Research. So this leads us to a conclusion. The research question, do certain genetic traits and trauma increase the likelihood of criminal behavior? Our methodology is quantitative correlational methodology with a 2x2 between subjects factorial design. The challenges is going to be the participants, trying to find them, the selection of the participants, confounding variables, the measurement of trauma, and construct validity within our surveys. But I do believe with the correct sampling and selection and correct surveys and the research that we pull from this design and model will be a better step toward this discovering if genetic traits and trauma play or increase violent criminal behavior. My name is Chase Beaty, and thank you for your time.